Welcome back to the Lou Perez Podcast. My name is Lou Perez. If you want to support the show, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community on locals.com. And be sure to follow me on all social media at @TheLouPerez. Here we go. I'm joined by my friend Gene Epstein, who just turned 76 years old. Happy birthday, Gene. Thanks for being here.
Lou. Thank you, Lou. And it's a pleasure to be on the podcast of a multi-talented guy such as yourself, a great comic, a great thinker, a great cerebral comic. There are quips of yours that I keep repeating. One of them about Obama. We could get into that one about how he couldn't make the wedding ceremony, but he did send a present. That was a great line of it. Remember when you did that, when you were my warm-up act at the Soul Forum. Lou, you said I just turned 76, but you haven't pointed out what an important guy I am, what a presence, why I am a force in the libertarian movement. I do direct the libertarian debate series, the Soul Forum, and you, of course, have been one of my regular attendees. You're often in the audience. You're a great admirer of what I do in that regard, and I was honored to have you as one of our warm-up actors at one point. That's when you told that classic joke on Obama. So it's a privilege to be here.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words. And yes, I do hold you in very high regard. And I have to apologize. We were supposed to record this on your birthday.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
There was a problem with the Wi-Fi. The spectrum that I use was taken down for a few hours.
I assume it wasn't Spectrum just trying to squelch a libertarian podcast. It wasn't anything political there.
Yeah,
we don't want to get too paranoid, Lou.
Not too paranoid. Man, I wish that I was the target of a conspiracy. That would be amazing. Although I have to say, you are now 1 year older, and I guess in solidarity, my neck hurts. On the left side of my neck hurts.
Oh, there you go. And you're how many revolutions around the sun have you recorded, Lou?
38. In February, it'll be 39.
38. Yeah. So I guess I think you multiply 38 by 2, you get 76. I think it's a perfect doubling there, Lou.
There we go.
My arithmetic is right. Yeah, it is right. 2 times 38 is 76. So I guess I have twice as much wisdom as you, Lou, hopefully, twice as much information to impart. So shoot, give me a question.
Yeah, well, I was actually gonna ask you that. Do you ever feel a little weight on your shoulder when it comes to being expected to have wisdom at your age, or do you welcome it?
Well, yeah, no, a little bit of ambivalence about that. I did an interview last week with a couple of young guys who were just asking me about whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and I've had an optimistic tendency all my life, and so I answered them that after just having been around the block with so many different experiences, I'm optimistic. And I guess by and large, I do feel it's legitimate to point out to people that I came of age in the 1960s. I lived through the 70s, 80s. I saw a lot of cycles and a lot of swings. And so, and then when you feel these things viscerally, it matters a lot. Obviously people like you can read history and those guys can read history, but having been through those, I was in Chicago in 68, demonstrating against the Democratic Convention. I avoided seeing that, I think it's a Netflix show about what happened in Chicago, partly because I thought it would probably be inauthentic. So again, that's a digression. My only point is that I've done a lot. I was a part of the New Left. I became a libertarian in my late 20s. And so I guess I feel that when people ask me the softer questions about where things are going, what the future will bring, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, then I guess I'm reasonably comfortable trotting out the fact that I've had a lot of experience. The harder questions, the more specific questions about what's going on, the analytical questions, I guess I shouldn't pull rank on anybody. I've got to do my homework just like anybody else.
Mm-hmm. With you described the New Left. What was that? How would you define the New Left?
Well, the New Left was originally sort of an outgrowth of the civil rights movement, and then it became empowered and steered by the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. And you could certainly say that that as a practical matter, those of us who joined Students for Democratic Society, SDS as it was known, started by Tom Hayden and others, and I.B. Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were part of that movement. We didn't want to get drafted, So I mean, the harsh and embarrassing reality is that we were all in danger of getting drafted into that war that required, 500,000 people, 500,000 soldiers at any one time. And of course, there was a lot of turnover, so they had to draft a lot of people. And we didn't want to get drafted. And so to some degree, we were operating out of self-interest. I still think, of course, the war in Indochina generally against Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, was a major crime against humanity. But we had a lot then to specifically object to. So when I went to Chicago in 1968 to demonstrate against the Democratic Convention, many of us were favoring Eugene McCarthy, who said he would end the war, and then Hubert Humphrey, who had been LBJ's vice president, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, who symbolized basically furthering the war, did get nominated. So we had a war, an ugly war to object to. I emphasize that because when you ask me what was the New Left all about, then I would have to say substantively we weren't about very much. In other words, what did we really want to change? What kind of society did we want? Did we really want a socialist society in line with what we saw in the Soviet Union or in Red China? There were people, I wasn't one of them, who were infatuated with Mao Zedong of Red China, who was later exposed to be obviously a mass murderer. There were people who thought of Ho Chi Minh, who was head of North Vietnam, as a great guy. I wasn't one of those. I just felt that the war was a major crime in any case. But apart from that, then those of us who were not enamored of any of these examples, we had just this vague idea that communal living was the whole idea, that we didn't want to work for corporations, we didn't want to work in business. We just wanted to form communes and pretty much make our own yogurt and grow our own food and raise our own animals. And in fact, that's what I did for a while. I went to the country and lived on a kind of commune that was more or less breaking up. And I found it to be an extremely hectic life. People had jobs during the day, but their houses were always breaking down. Their cars were always breaking down. They were raising their animals, growing their vegetables, and keeping that. And so I thought the pace of life was way too much. Communal living was not for me and not for most other people. So we gave up on that. I guess that's the sort of the long-winded answer to what the New Left was all about. But then when when Nixon ended the draft in the early 1970s, then resistance to the war faded. Then the fear of getting drafted faded. And then the New Left, I mean, a thumbnail description of what happened is, of course, then it splintered into the weather people who were blowing up buildings, crazy people who decided they'd go to a payphone at night. They'd call up security at the building and say, "Everybody, please get out because the building is about to blow up in 10 minutes." Nobody ever thought, and even to this day, they don't ever thought, you go to a payphone. What if the call doesn't get through? The building's going to blow up and people are going to get killed. So that's what these crazy weather people were doing. They were just resorting to violence, and that was part of the the death throes of the New Left. But so that's the long-winded short story version of my experience with the New Left.
I'm really intrigued by groups like the Weathermen, who later I guess became the Weather Underground, and all of these other sort of guerrilla tactics that were being used in the 60s and the 70s. It's almost it almost feels like not only a different time period, but a different country. When you think about people planting bombs and that sort of thing, or at least me now in the year 2020, the closest that that comes to it would be, I guess, the Oklahoma City bombing or something like that. Why? I watched a documentary about the Weathermen. I think it was made in the early 2000s. And it seems like most of the people involved went on to have success in academia. It seems like there's quite a few, quite a few professors and that sort of, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Bill Ayers. Yeah, they went into indeed. Yeah, no, I was actually a graduate student at the New School in downtown Manhattan, and suddenly we heard this major explosion. And in fact, perhaps if you read about or saw a film about the Weather Underground, that was when Kathy Wilkerson and I'm forgetting all their names, Kathy Boudin, uh, and Lou and Bill Ayers. They were at a brownstone that belonged to the parents of one of them, and they were making bombs in the basement. Brownstone on 11th Street. It was actually right next door to Dustin Hoffman's brownstone. Dustin Hoffman, the actor, and something went wrong in their atom bomb testing. I'm sorry, terrible for me to laugh because a couple of them were killed. And oops, there's a light that I got to turn back on here. A couple of them were killed, and Dustin Hoffman ran out with his parakeet, I think it was. Anyway, so just crazy, stupid antics on their part. But it's interesting that you say that it seems like a foreign country, because I guess you'd say that the violence of the last few months has not been accompanied by sort of bombing on a grand scale. But of course, I guess now that you've sort of asked me, do I try to sound like a gray eminence half the time? Do I sound like a pompous old fart when I can? I guess I do. I try to tell people that I knew then that nonviolence, nonviolent resistance was overwhelmingly the only way to go. The state has a monopoly of violence. That nonviolent resistance, as exemplified by Mahatma Gandhi, by Martin Luther King, can be very effective, and it's certainly effective in this kind of environment. Was effective then under King, and could be effective today. And I do occasionally talk to some relatives who counsel violence. It's both impractical, stupid, and of course, people get hurt. Property gets destroyed, evil gets done, and in the name of, obviously that corrupts you in any case. But just in terms of pure tactics, nonviolent resistance is the only way to go. I've been trying to organize nonviolent resistance against the lockdowns, but I'm not that much of a leader, not practiced at it. So I've just been talking about it, not actually doing much about it.
Yeah, I think as we've seen with warfare in general, even the idea of targeted bombings or targeted drone strikes often has collateral damage. And I remember from that documentary about the Weathermen, that scene that you described, the one that there was actually stock footage of Dustin Hoffman standing outside of that building that had exploded.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and I don't know if he was living with Gene Hackman at the time. I remember hearing that those two were roommates or something.
Yeah, no. He he and Gene Hackman, and on top of that, Robert Duvall were actually roommates. So I was like the story, three ordinary looking guys who want to become actors. And then amazingly, all three of them become almost superstars. And that's a great story. No, but this, I think, was after The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman's big breakout role had been produced, and he was in the money. I think he was living with his then wife/girlfriend at the time. If I have my dates right, I think this was after The Graduate had come out, so he was already a star, and he was no longer needing to bunk with those guys, for what that's worth.
Yeah,
but
anyway. This was. I bring this up because in the doc, I think that explosion led to the death of, I think, two members of the Weathermen.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that might have been like the first time that as an organization or as a group they thought, wow, but we just lost two of our comrades. Like, there is death in what we're doing. Maybe we should change tactics.
Did they really? Okay, then
at least according to the doc.
Well, that's interesting. I haven't followed. I obviously knew them. I actually met Kathy Wilkerson. Kathy Boudin then later became. Kathy Boudin. Boy, I'm forgetting the name of the. Perhaps you remember the name of the woman, Bernadine Dorn. But this is funny that years later we had. I was raising my kids on the Upper West Side. And my then wife said she was at a meeting of parents, and we're going around the room, and one of the women said, "I'm Kathy Boudin," and everybody said, "Oh my God, wow!" They just audibly, "Kathy Boudin, what are you doing here? I thought you were in prison for blowing people up." She'd been sprung, and then oh, that's right. And then she managed to become a lawyer. So the odd part of it is that these people really were involved with wreaking death, but they mostly came out in pretty good shape. The society forgave them. They did do time. They suffered certainly for their sins, but this was not that many years later that she was just a parent in New York, and she was doing okay.
I wonder if that sort of can stand as a model of forgiveness in a way, where it's like because it seems like we're sort of in a time, I guess, with cancel culture and that sort of thing, where you see people's lives upended over jokes, over a statement, here or there. But meanwhile, you have people who actually planted bombs, blew shit up, and somehow you're at a PTA meeting with this person, how many decades later.
Yeah, indeed. I know. Well, what we can forgive and what we can't. It's pretty weird. It's I guess you're pushing my 76-year-old wisdom there, Lou. I don't know if I can give you wise words about that. I'll think about that one though, about when we should forgive and when we shouldn't. And you'll say, "Well, thank you, Rabbi Epstein, for those insights." But I'll have to pass on that question for the moment. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that you didn't contact me on Yom Kippur, so and you didn't have to. You have nothing to be sorry about when it comes to me.
I used to do a column about economic sins, my sins as a columnist. And when I had been, I guess you haven't mentioned one of my other credits on my Vita. For 26 years, I was economics and books editor of Barron's Financial Weekly, and I did a weekly column about the economy. I left in 2018, having been basically pushed out by new management. But I had a 26-year run there, and I had a good time. And every year I did do a Yom Kippur column, although one of the editors finally, who was Jewish, finally said that she found this very offensive, that I was turning Yom Kippur into my own kind of confessional. And I could have told her, "Look, I can still look. Judaism is all over the place. There's Reform Judaism. There are agnostic rabbis. We do any damn thing, we Jews." I didn't give her guff. I just didn't do the column that year because she got so upset at my doing it, when she herself was going to shul and atoning for her sins, and I was making it into some kind of circus and actually polling people on who should atone for what sins and so on. And obviously, this year, of course, the Yom Kippur column would be a mile long on all the sins that so many people have committed. I was narrowing it to economics, but even narrowed to economics, it would be a pretty long list.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk a little bit about libertarians in general. I think you pointed something out on Twitter where oftentimes, anytime libertarianism is brought up, people who aren't libertarians seem to think like, "Oh, they're just a bunch of old white guys." And you pointed out the amount of prominent libertarians throughout history who are Jewish and who are black, and I started sort of running down the Rolodex of all the libertarians that have had a huge impact in my life, and I'm like, yeah, you know what? A lot of black guys, a lot of Jewish guys.
A lot of black guys. Well, I have to say, of course, basically, it's dominated by the Jews have dominated the socialists, and the Jews have dominated the libertarians. It's just crazy because I do think dominated is certainly defensible, given the fact that Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard were both Jewish, and those are two just alone. There's not much oxygen left after you got those two. But when with respect to blacks, I revere Thomas Sowell, even though when it comes to a fair number of writings on foreign policy, I would call him a neocon, and I guess he would not call himself a libertarian, but certainly he has a great deal to teach libertarians. With respect to blacks, who else would you? Walter Williams. Who else do you have in mind?
Yeah, I think Walter Williams, especially there was that. That series Free to Choose, where Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell figure prominently. I think
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it might be telling about me where I'm like, wait, Lou thinks two black guys is a lot of black guys. Is that
no, really. Well, the fact, I would extend the list.
Sure.
There are a lot of really fantastic and eloquent black thinkers, and Thomas Sowell is definitely a giant, and so just him alone. Walter Williams has not quite had his out, but Walter Williams, however, in his own right, is a brilliant guy. Although I would certainly say that Sowell is in a class by himself. Actually, when people ask me to recommend a book on economics, I often cite Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell as perhaps the first book you should read, even though Sowell isn't even quite an Austrian in the sense that Sowell doesn't quite understand Austrian business cycle theory. But that book is so superb, and so many of his writings are so superb that I do think that he belongs on our Mount Rushmore. But then beyond that, Walter Williams, and then there are other younger guys from John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, Jason Riley. Many of them, they don't quite talk about politics, but much of what they have to say is really great. Jason Riley, in particular, is a disciple of Sowell. So we do have, do have some great guys in the room. Young and old.
Glenn Lowry is definitely one of my favorite thinkers ever, and it's one of those things where I wonder how many of them would accept the label of a libertarian, even if it is a small L libertarian. Because I think we lose a lot of people on the economic side. I think on a lot of the social stuff, on free speech and that sort of thing. We have quite a few people who are with us, but when it comes to the economics, they sort of, veer.
Yeah, and what I also want to name because the recent movie What Killed Michael Brown,
right,
and that was why am I drawing a blank on the
Eli Steele and Shelby Steele, his father.
Shelby, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Shelby, and because Shelby is the guy who's in it, and I remember reading his book. These guys, I bet for what it's worth, if we're parsing out all the nuances in the libertarian spectrum. Richard Epstein, who is, of course, a Jew and no relation to me, last I checked, and neither, by the way, is Jeffrey Epstein, I want you to know. And because
I had all these questions about that island, and man.
Despite myself, I sort of personally winced for a while there every time there was a headline with Epstein this and Epstein that, but no, he's not either. But Richard Epstein, of course, is correctly categorizes himself as a classical liberal. You have to use two words. He's a fellow Trump. He correctly points out he goes 85% of the way with libertarians. And that's legitimate. And probably those other guys that we most mentioned, the black guys in particular, would call themselves classical liberal if we were to ask them about that particular label. They would tend to say conservative, but classical liberal fits them. And certainly, we don't want a lot of infighting. We want alliances where we can get them, and we want to be candid about our disagreements. But definitely promote people who valuably contribute to our thinking, even though we don't go all the way with them, and even though many of them would not laugh at that joke of yours, Lou, about Obama sending the president the bomb at the wedding, because those guys apparently just cannot explore the implications of their beliefs when it comes to American foreign policy, and will never seem to bring them around.
Well, you've definitely done your part trying to bring people together who disagree with the Soho Forum debates, and like you said, I've been at a number of them, and my favorite that I actually got to see in person, you weren't the moderator, but you were the one of the debaters, and that was against Bhaskar from Jacobin.
Oh my gosh. That was my embarrassment. That's when I lost my temper.
Yeah. So if people, I guess if they don't know what Gene is like when he loses his temper, apparently it involves saying your opponent's first name many times with
I did. I
more
said it,
sternly at it.
Yeah, got it. No, I was under pressure. Yeah, no. Well, let me just give full context there and say that number one, that actually has gotten nearly 100,000 YouTube videos, which is pretty good. But then I got criticized by everybody for having lost my temper with Bhaskar, and partly I was under pressure. What had actually happened was my operations assistant. Speaking of pregnancies, you've got an 8-month-old, so she suddenly. Uh, 8 weeks early, she went into labor. And so I lost her. So I had to organize without her, with just a couple of stringers, this immense event. And I had to do work overtime for it.
You had to change venues. It was originally at a smaller venue, and then you got this.
Yeah, we changed
venues,
but I was all set to use my operations assistant, Jane Menton, who's very important. But then she understandably had to go on emergency pregnancy leave. And then I didn't have anybody else. So I was under pressure to organize it completely on my own. And so I felt a sort of state of tension. I think that's part of the reason why I lost it, because I remember when Bhaskar was up there talking about profits and depreciation, I remember thinking back at that moment, that's where something clicked off in me and I got contemptuous. And that's when I got up and said, learn some economics, Bhaskar. Dave Smith says that every once in a while his wife says that to him. It's been a classic insult now. Learn some economics, Bhaskar. And so I lost it. And but then a lot of people fairly criticized me. A lot of young people said, "Oh, you just had a lot of passion, and why not? You did get your message across." I listened to it, and I said I didn't lose my temper to the point where I became incoherent. My message seemed to be clear, but certainly I could have been gentler with them. But then, cut to about a year later, I did another socialist debate with Professor Richard Wolff.
Right.
And there I didn't lose my temper because I learned my lesson to control these angry passions of mine. And that has had over 1.8 million YouTube views. So I'm proud that one has eclipsed my one with Bhaskar.
Well, I just want to point out I think it's really telling in that, we're over a year removed from that debate that you had with Bhaskar, and you're still thinking about, hey, did I lose my temper? Meanwhile, this guy recently went on Twitter and basically said, the fact that the children of the Tsar in Russia were murdered, well, that's fine because the revolution was more important. And you guys can go on Twitter and find his specific tweet about that.
He wrote that? Really? He did?
Yeah. And not in those exact words, but and I just find it. And I remember I emailed you after that first debate, basically thanking you for what I think was basically showing the ideology for what it is, whether it's socialism or democratic socialism, what you want to call it, and I would describe Bhaskar and his ilk as the type of people who don't want to tell you exactly what they have planned for you when the revolution comes. And you got him to be open about that. And it's basically, no, they want the ownership of the means of production. And if you have the audacity to want to do something on your own, especially in a business setting or something like that, they want to throw you in prison. They want to jail you for voluntary exchanges between people.
I guess you could say that, Lou. That quote that you just threw at me from Bhaskar actually does surprise me. I would put it somewhat differently from the way you put it, but then given that quote from Bhaskar, maybe you have a point. But in any case, setting that one aside, I would say that they're sort of all over the map. They do many times say that they don't want to go the way of the Soviet Union. They don't want to imitate Mao's China. And then about a half hour later, they're suddenly saying something nice about the Soviet Union, about Mao's China. Richard Wolff did that with me on the stage. I actually said, I've been saying something, and Richard has gotten defensive about the Soviet Union. But most of the time, he tells us that he repudiates the Soviet Union. He wrote a book about repudiating it. But then the next thing you know, that they're fickle about it. The next thing you know, they're suddenly endorsing the Soviet Union in a certain way. So the most charitable thing to say about them is that they're somewhat confused. Bhaskar wrote a whole book about his socialism and was extremely vague about quite how it would work. Richard wrote a book that was pretty specific. Richard Wolff, a much older guy, actually a couple years older than I, who wrote a book called Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. And in that debate, with Richard, I was able to do a deep dive into the book and point out what would happen, how freedom would be trampled on, how innovation would be trampled on. Then Richard surprises me by getting up and saying that he doesn't remember what's in that book. He wrote it 6 years ago. So,
Wow.
I mean, again, that's the way they talk. So in a way, it's sort of like punching a pillow to talk to these people. The way you're putting it sounds a little bit too harsh. Would they really down the line defend the Soviet Union? Would they really down the line defend Mao's China or Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam? Probably not. But then every once in a while they surprise you by sort of doing that. I guess it's sort of like the intellectual death throes of these people. Because as you know, if you because you were at that debate with Bhaskar, my main point is that if they really want what we did in the 1960s and 70s, mainly in the 70s, who left, put our sort of action where our mouths were. We formed communes. We went in for, communal ownership. We tried all that, and it just wasn't something we really wanted to do. It wasn't that we find that the contract that we make with capitalists, which is that they take on the headaches and risks of running the organization and we earn a salary, that deal is pretty much what most of us want to accept. But I again hasten to say that if you really want the means of production to be owned and operated by the workers, as Richard does in that book of his, Democracy at Work, then it's perfectly doable under capitalism.
Right.
The 1/3 of all consumption is accounted for by the lower half of the population. Nearly 2/3 by the lower 80%. There's all that consumer firepower. There's $1 trillion in the hands of the labor unions domestically. There are many trillions of dollars in the hands of labor unions internationally. There are all kinds of routes whereby they could buy up companies, boycott companies, if they want to take over the means of production by capitalist means. Capitalism offers them that choice. And indeed, to some degree, we already have it. We do have, obviously, people who don't want to work for bosses. I guess we probably have Lou Perez, who wants to be an independent. And so you can have that option. And if it really does speak to the hearts and minds of the broad masses of people, it would become an easy thing to bring about, because then there could be organizations that would further it. And so that's my point about their core belief, to the extent that we can take them seriously. If you don't want to be answerable to a boss and you want to be a part of a commune, that kind of life is perfectly possible. Just convince some other people to do it with you. So that was my main refutation of their point of view, to the extent that I can take them seriously at all.
Yeah, and I thought that was brilliant. I often explain it where, under my system that I want to see, you're able to be a socialist and do that thing. But under your version, the socialist version, I am unable to do what it is that I want to do. And I was looking up the quote from Bhaskar, Sunkara, which it appears to be deleted on Twitter, but somebody over at the AmericanConservative.com saved it. And I remember this one. Bhaskar writes, "The question isn't what we think justice demands. I think killing little Romanov children was justified. But it's not surprising why these views are controversial, given most people's ethical and moral frameworks."
Oh, wow.
So
I see.
And this,
wow. But then why was it take? Do you think Bhaskar? I want to be nice to the guy. You think Bhaskar just thought it was a bad idea and he took it down? Maybe it was
maybe, and that's possible. And and I would have a good faith discussion with him and say that, hey, sometimes we post things out that we put things out that we don't actually mean, and then on second thought, or when people come at us and actually ask more probing questions about what we stated, maybe there was a change of heart there. But on its face, it seems like something that I just think is is pretty evil.
Oh
Right?
yeah, no, absolutely,
Yeah.
and indeed, I mean, I would go for I remember years ago talking to my socialist cousin, who when I asked him about how he felt about the Russian Revolution, he was a Trotskyite, so he felt the Russian Revolution had taken a wrong turn,
Mm.
and because we get into all the nuances of the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, the Trotskyites, and all the rest of them. But anyway, but his stock answer that he fell back on was, well, you can criticize Stalinism and Leninism, as I do, he said, of course, but it certainly was an improvement over the czars. And I didn't argue with that one, but the truth is that if we wanted to argue that one, it was definitely not an improvement over the czars. The economy was improving. There's plenty of progress being made under the czars. Much better things would have happened to the Russians had the Russian Revolution never happened. That's absolutely certain. So killing the Romanov kids certainly ushered in an awful reign of terror that was far, far worse than what the Romanovs were doing.
Yeah, I find it too often where you have that sort of response, and
Yeah,
the one I hear it all the time is when it comes to Cuba,
yeah,
and the two things that people always point to is, well, they have very high literacy rates
yeah,
and free healthcare, and
yeah,
it's like, wow, you really need to have decades and decades and decades of a dictator in
yeah,
order to reach those dreams
yeah,
of high literacy in a country where they go after librarians, in a country where you're not allowed to have collections of books. Nat Hentoff pointed that out. I think he was writing. I don't know if it was in the Village Voice or Cato, years ago. But it's like
yeah,
when your country is jailing librarians,
yeah.
it's time to really think about what path you're on.
About the high literacy rate, about what those people. Well, indeed, in the case of Cuba, I mean, I have a long history with this. As I famously told everybody, mommy was a commie, and my mother was active in the Fair Play for Cuba committee, and in fact, she took a picture with Castro, and she visited Cuba, and she was talking up the place, and. There too, we'd have to make the difficult argument, but I think it's easy enough to sustain that that the despot Batista was better than Castro. That Castro was not Stalin. That's sure. We certainly can't put him in Stalin's category or Lenin's, but certainly there was already a high literacy rate, generally high. Level of material well-being in Cuba compared to any other Latin American country. It had been growing. It was hardly ideal under Batista, but certainly Castro was definitely a turn for the worse. So there too, we can even make that kind of grim comparison. Yeah.
I remember you telling stories about your mother,
Yeah.
the communist, and recently I watched the movie Reds
Oh,
from
right.
Warren
Oh,
Beatty,
one of my mother's favorite movies. Yeah,
and
yeah.
I was very I was ready to hate the movie on ideological grounds and all that,
Oh,
but
oh,
there's something one of the beautiful things about art is that it's able to cut through ideology,
oh.
and I think it was such a brilliant movie. It's beautifully performed. It's an epic movie. I think it's close to like 4 hours,
Yeah. No,
and
well,
it's just
it's
so
a
well
little over
done.
3 hours.
A little over three.
Yeah, yeah. But
In,
still
in,
long, still long.
yeah, in my in my world of instant gratification, 3 hours is now
Yeah,
equivalent
I know. I
to.
was about to tell you that, Lou, but I didn't want to
There's an
insult you that
intermission.
way.
There's an intermission, Gene. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
but what?
Yeah, yeah. No, I wanted to mention about that movie. Well, actually, Lou, I would go beyond that. I know that movie quite well. I think it's a good movie. I think it's a little bit flawed. The spectacular parts when the revolution happens, they're just singing was a little bit tinny, but it's a good movie. It's a good
Mhm.
movie, not a great film. I don't put it among my favorite 20, but it is a good film. But in fact, my mother loved it. And her husband did. My mother's second husband was a Stalinist, and they thought it was a great film. And obviously, of course, to be depicted by Diane Keaton and Warren Beatty playing John Reed, the guy who was president of the Russian Revolution. It's a great story and well acted. acted. But getting to the point about the theme of the film, the Maureen Stapleton character, the Emma Goldman character, played by Maureen Stapleton, the actress, she's telling the John Reed, played by Warren Beatty, the revolution's being betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
She is giving that message. She's a rock rib socialist, and she's saying this is not the way to go. And then he says to her, Russia's the first country of socialism, and we have to support it. So I think that at that point, the film gets appropriately sort of didactic and messagey, and it does say that that even if you are a socialist, the ideals of socialism were betrayed. The ideas of democratic / sort of libertarian liberal socialism were betrayed by the Russian Revolution. It is a kind of a message film in that way, I would say legitimately, because I think Maureen Stapleton has the better of the argument, because all the Warren Beatty, John Reed characters are able to say it's the first country of socialism, we have to support it. Rather a lame reason to support a revolution that Maureen Stapleton says is being betrayed in the person of Emma Goldman. I actually said that to my mother. I said, you like that film? Because, of course, we were arguing all the time about socialism versus capitalism. I'd been a democratic socialist, but then by that point, I was no longer a socialist. And I said, that's the point of the film, Mother. And my mother says, no. She said, he said, Russia is the first country of socialism, and we've got to support it. She thought that was a killer argument. So that of course shows how probably my mother and I belong in that film. Actually, come to think of it, the only other inadequacy of the film is that they have all of these faces from the past, all these people who actually existed, who were talking, Henry Miller, and others.
They're talking head sort of segues at some point. So it's sort of a mix of documentary.
Precisely, and it's actual people playing themselves, making statements, and it does have a nice effect on the film, gives it a kind of a nice historical context. I know I'm getting into this, but they certainly should have put the names across the screen. They should have. They could have a name and a sort of brief connection. It would have helped, I think, rather than just having these and just having to do guesswork, as to who is this and who is that. It's still a good film, and I recommend it to others. And I do think that it is, of course, about a guy who's pursuing a dream. He's a great guy, John Reed. Remember also when come to think of it, remember when he gets censored by the Russian commissar. I mean, that in itself is, and he's saying, you're killing my soul. He had been censored by the capitalists, now he's censored by the socialists. And there was that scene where he runs off pursuing something in the distance, and sort of that's the beautiful metaphor for the fact that he's pursuing a dream that is simply not going to be realized. So that there too, I guess, come to think of it, that's the argument I should have used with my mom. But mom died at the age of 92, and she's no longer here around to hear my arguments.
Did your mother's husband ever recant his Stalinism?
He died in a shower of a heart attack at the age of 65, Lou, just to be vivid about it. And this was in the 1980s. My mom did. My mom lived. She died in 2007. So she lived to see a lot. And at the age of 92. So indeed, she did renounce her enthusiasm for the Soviet Union once. Although she used to say to me, "Don't you believe in worker ownership?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course I do. I think it's possible." She latched on that a little bit, but she did indeed. I guess we could do a great documentary about my mom, Lou, but there's probably not enough footage for her. But maybe Maureen Stapleton can play, or Diane Keane, and so on. Just her odyssey. She lost custody of her own kids because she was a communist. So she paid a price. And so that's her story. But indeed, she did renounce her communism because she was in her late 80s and early 90s and getting a little bit feeble. You know me, Lou. I don't want to take advantage of old people, so I didn't really argue with her too strenuously. Because when she was saying that, she was giving up on the socialist dream, I thought that was good enough. A very nice concession for her to make.
You and your brother were taken out of your mother's custody because she was a communist?
Well, basically, yeah. My father, my father, who was basically an FDR liberal, a very kid born a young child of poor immigrants who became a millionaire in business. He got custody of the kids. My mother had not only been a card-carrying communist, under the pseudonym Rhoda Warren. They were all told, use a pseudonym so that you can't be traced too easily. Her pseudonym was Rhoda Warren. My father was able to prove that she was a communist, and on top of that, mainly in reaction to my father's own infidelities, my mother started to sleep with black guys in the party. And I always suspected that black guys were joining the party in order to meet my mom. I think that was maybe the big lure, because most of those black guys, as you know, favor libertarianism. But anyway, so the idea that in the early 1950s, you're not only a communist, but you're committing adultery with black guys, that was bad enough. That was 2 strikes against her. I'll tell you something funny. My mother's FBI file, which I got, from the Freedom of Information Act, they're following her around. And they keep saying in this little memo, we're thinking of approaching her to be a double agent. Double agent being that instead of being that you'll be a turncoat and inform on your fellows. She said on your fellow communists. But she is a deeply immoral woman, and we cannot do that. She's too immoral to be trusted as a double agent.
Traitor. She's too immoral to be a traitor.
To be a traitor to her friends. But then I knew where they got this from, because the court ruling. This is in the 1950s. The court ruling, which was. There were 3 divorce trials and 3 custody trials. So I spent a lot of my youth in and out of courtrooms. But anyway, the final court ruling said that while it is not usual to give custody to the father, even when the mother has committed adultery, but this is a deeply immoral woman. In other words, that even though she had committed adultery, we would normally give her custody, but she is a deeply immoral woman. And I knew what that meant was that she was a communist and she'd been sleeping with black guys. That made you deeply immoral. And that's why she lost custody. But then it's just funny that the FBI file echoed the opinion of the court. That she was a deeply immoral woman who couldn't approach as a double agent. So she paid a price.
Yeah. No, I can't imagine the pain your mother must have been going through at that time. That's incredible. And just, like you said, later on in life, not, hammering her about her, the Stalinism or communism. It's,
I argued with her pretty vociferously, Lou, throughout. I mean, certainly she lasted a long time, and I did. The way we were was also one of her favorite films. There's Barbra Streisand's a commie, and her boyfriend is Robert Redford, who rejects her because she's too committed. So my mother loved movies with those themes. But probably the Reds most of all. So I argued with her pretty strenuously, but she gave as good as she got, Lou. Come on, she did. She was pretty feisty. Anyway.
If you have a file with the FBI, you're probably some level of badass. Right?
That's a good question, Lou. I've been wanting to do more research into it. I had an Uncle Abe who had a file. It seemed like they were really just going after everybody. My mother quit the party. She'd quit the party because she knew that it would be difficult for her.
And then all the black men quit. Like they're like, they had no more. It was like, what's going on? We need a diversity and inclusion council here.
Precisely. There was a big exodus from the party at that point on the part of the African-American community and a number of Jews like my mom. But my mother quit strategically, but then they were still following her around because, as you perhaps know, the Rosenbergs who were, the Rosenbergs who were executed for being atom bomb spies, they had quit the party years before. And of course, that was part of the ruse that in order to be a spy, you confuse the powers that be by quitting the party. So the FBI was not trusting anybody. If you'd been a commie, then maybe you're still working underground for the party, And I do use the joke that I don't even know the source of it, that 1 out of every 10 members of the Communist Party was an FBI agent, and the joke is you could tell who the FBI agents were in the party because they were the only ones who paid their dues on time. And so it was heavily infiltrated, and that's why I never thought that the House Un-American Activities Committee really did any purpose to investigate communists. I mean, they knew who was a communist. 1 out of of 10 FBI agents was a communist. They were monitoring their every move. And of course, for what it's worth, these communists, my mother included, they were not violent people. They did believe in electoral politics. They put up their candidates. They didn't blow up buildings, for what that's worth. I mean, they did. I get a pass from my fellow libertarians, I guess, because everybody says, wow. I mean, Bob Murphy said to somebody else, wow, who can match Gene Epstein's child? The FBI follows his mom around,
Right.
Everybody gets excited by that. Nobody shames me and said, and you're proud of your mom and she supported Joe Stalin, one of the greatest mass murderers of all time, and you're proud of that? I'm not proud of that. I tend to give her a pass because she sort of was well-intentioned. I tend to give most of them a pass. They were confused, well-intentioned. They weren't violent, but and they were, for the most part, not too effective. So I tend to forgive them. But then if somebody wants to come after me and say, how can you forgive people who supported Joe Stalin? I have to say, well, yeah, you do have a point. There's something to what you say.
I wonder how much of it too is just so many people just don't take into account the historical context as well. I mean, we're here in 2020. The files from the KGB have been made public. If we're dealing at a movie that I highly recommend is Mr. Jones. Have you seen that?
Oh yes, indeed. I did a screening of it at my home, Mr. Jones. About the journalist who in the late 1930s, British journalist, travels to the Soviet Union and uncovers Stalin's campaign to starve the Ukrainians. And hundreds of thousands died of starvation. And then, of course, contrasted by Walter Duranty, brilliantly played by, I forget the actor's name, Walter Duranty, the New York Times journalist who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing whitewash about the Soviet Union at the time in the late 1930s.
Yeah. So just thinking about, if you're an American at the time and you're, a card-carrying communist and you're looking to the New York Times as your inside, your inside information to what's happening, with the world, and Walter Duranty's coming back and saying, no, things are wonderful in the Soviet Union.
Well, Lou, you have to be. You're right. It's an interesting to trace, and of course, it's something that I've always thought about, and I perhaps should know more about it than I do. But Bertrand Russell, who was a socialist, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, he traveled to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. He was not at all impressed. He saw through what was going on, as indeed the Emma Goldman character does in Reds. Sees the fascism of the government. Maybe doesn't see the major crimes, but understands that these are authoritarian people, and this is going to not go well. John Maynard Keynes in the late 1930s celebrated the Soviet Union, certainly had access to information, and indeed in the movie, I haven't checked the facts exactly, but Mr. Jones's Gareth Jones was his name. His article did come to light about what was going on there. We have a strange thing in that film, if you recall. It's a nice touch that George Orwell is woven into the story, but I didn't quite believe toward the end of the film, even though it's great dialogue, that George Orwell would say to Gareth Jones, Gareth Jones says, I only know what I saw. I know what I saw. And George Orwell says, oh, I'm sure you do. But you don't appreciate the larger context. The old excuse for awful crimes being committed. But I don't think that that's really what George Orwell would have said, even though it's great dialogue, and I didn't object to it too strongly. But I'm only saying that by the late 1930s, I think enough information was coming out about what was going on there, so that anybody, certainly like John Maynard Keynes in particular, couldn't be given a pass. And any literate Jew, come on, my mother was she was Jewish. She read things. They should have known. And then aside from that, Lou, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, who took over, delivered a quote-unquote secret speech that wasn't secret at all, in which he condemned Stalin's crimes. And that was when there was another huge exodus from the Communist Party, which my mother did not participate in at that point. She left the Communist Party for practical reasons because she was fighting for custody, but she was still loyal to communism and the Communist Party even after that revelation. They, you know what their usual excuse was? Well, Stalin was pretty bad. They tend to minimize it. They'll argue about how many people they really killed and all the rest of it. But Stalin is history now. Now we've got Nikita Khrushchev in charge. Any number of crazy excuses to stay loyal to the party. So I'm a little. You seem to be a little bit more lenient than I on these people. Except, of course, she was my mom. And I think, again, they weren't violent. They did deal in electoral politics. They were deluded. They were ignorant, but they sort of meant well. They had good attitudes. They didn't hate you. They weren't Nazis. They didn't. When Nazism is sort of like defined as hating Jews, Stalin was indeed a Jew hater, but their basic beliefs did not involve hatred. So at least to some degree, I give them a pass partly for that reason as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My son. Like we said, he's 8 months old, and we've been collecting a lot of children's books for us to read with him. Yeah. And we have a friend of ours who has a daughter who gave us a bunch of books. These little books. I think it's from a series called like Little Feminists or something like that. Mm-hmm. And in one of the books, it had. So you have artists, you have leaders, you have all this stuff, and one of the artists that they have in the book is Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist, and I I couldn't fail, but I had to point out it's like, so I guess in order to be a good little feminist, you also have to be a Stalinist, and it was sort of the idea of doesn't she look cute with her unibrow? Way to go, ladies.
When her boyfriend or sort of fellow artist was the muralist and Stalinist. What was the name again?
Is it Diego something?
Diego Rivera, was it?
Rivera,
yeah, I think.
Yeah. And I got to when we took a trip to Mexico City when my wife was pregnant with our son, and of course we had to go to the Frida Kahlo Museum, and in her bedroom there's a picture of a painting of Marx and Stalin and I think Lenin, and I took a picture in front of it, a photograph in front of it, with a very upset look on my face. I was just a disgusted look on my face.
The fact that I guess to sort of in a way to cap it all off, in a way, sort of the biggest movie about this really was Reds, and certainly Reds definitely portrays these people as charming, well-intentioned. They were feminist. They were they were sort of precursors of the New Left. They lived in communal environments. They were egalitarian. They had all kinds of good attitudes, and so in a way, it's difficult to condemn them in any summary fashion. Yeah.
Well, in the New York Times, they had that series not too long ago about I guess all of the good stuff about communism. There was an article about how women had better sex under communist
better sex
rule.
Under communism. Yeah, that was Did you search that one down, Lou? And did you find out whether they really did have better sex under communism? It was just I just could not believe that. It was some your fellow comic Andrew Heaton. It's like the stuff when the title of his book, Laughter is Better Than Communism. So I thought, you could do a riff on that. Is sex better than under communism than under capital? That's sort of like the stuff of comedy rather than really serious research, because I think it's very difficult to determine an answer to that question, Lou.
Or maybe there's something to the idea when you're not sure if the secret police are going to come for your lover at any moment. So it's like every single time you do it, it's like the last time on Earth. Or
that could be, but I mean, and aside from that, when you really focus on it, as has been reported and maybe not fully documented, there was a sort of sexual dolce vita among the sexual predators of the Soviet Union, the party guys. It's depicted in another film about East Germany. And we've been recommending films the whole time. Now I'm forgetting that one about East Germany. Anyway, obviously it is about, it does portray the guys in East Germany basically sexually exploiting the women. You you have nowhere else to go. You can't quit your job, and so if they want to rush you into bed, you have very little choice. And apparently, that was pretty much commonly practiced in many of these countries, and the Soviet Union in particular, because that gives sexual predators extraordinary power, because you have nowhere else to go, no alternative but to stick with that job, stick with that bureaucracy, and have to suffer the harassment of a sexually predatory male. So that was pretty common as well. So I don't know how good that sex was. I'm
Right.
sure it was pretty unpleasant.
Yeah.
The Lives of Others. Is that the movie? You remember that one? The Lives
Oh,
of
The Lives of Others. That's
Yeah,
that takes place in East Germany, right?
East Germany. That's about the Stasi, and then it was, because it actually has a kind of a happy ending, about the Stasi and how under East Germany, and then of course it also continues to the point where East Germany is liberated, the Berlin Wall comes down, and certain retribution is handed out. So it kind of has a happy ending.
Yeah,
And another good film. We've recommended some really good ones here, Lou.
I
And
know.
The Way We Were is good as well, although it's not quite about politics.
Uh, um, it's talking about the Stasi.
Yeah,
How do you feel about the calls, at least on social media that I've seen,
yeah,
for making new lists, for making lists of the people who were part of the Trump administration, perhaps making lists of deplorables. There was a guy, a blue check mark, so you know that he's very important on Twitter, who wants to. What is it? He wants to re-educate, I believe, the 70 some odd million people who voted for Trump. Is there a way that we could re-educate these people? And
yeah, yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if this is sort of yet another example of perhaps what Bhaskar, from the Jacobin, is about, where the gravity of your statement is just is not apprehended by the people making making the statement. Where it's like, well, what does, like, no, say these words actually had power and were able to make things happen in the world. Do you have any idea what this would mean? What it would mean to deprogram 70 million people? What would have to go into that? Do you have any idea what making a list of the deplorables would entail? And to me, it's just, I don't know,
yeah. Well,
freaks
no,
me
it's
out.
indeed. You're absolutely right. Of course, that's shades of that, all of the ways in which socialist regimes, Mao Zedong in particular, sent people off to the farms. I mean, you have to re-educate people. That's the whole idea of that kind of socialism. That the iron fist of government comes in and forcibly re-educates people, and of course, only makes them bitter and miserable in the process. That was particularly the Soviet Union. And Castro was doing that a bit as well, and so it's clearly pretty ugly. I mean, obviously, I guess on different levels, we want to point out to those re-educationists that if you want to hold your own soul forum, if you want to
Right.
put out some tweets, you want to put out some articles and re-educate those deplorables, then probably you don't want to call them deplorables in the first place, since that doesn't really educate anybody very much when you call them names. But do it the way we classical liberals would want you to do it. But apart from that, beyond that, who are you people to educate us at all? Why don't you just sort of start with a Lou Perez joke about how Obama sent a present to the wedding in the form of a drone attack, and then you'll understand that you people need a bit of re-educating yourself. In fact, far more re-educating than many of the rest of us do, even though I, of course, totally agree that Trump needs some education and Trump supporters need it as well. But those re-educationists need it at least as urgently as the Trump supporters do. And and you, of course, have been helpful in doing that, because using comedy, as you have, Lou, is a great way to get the message across.
I really appreciate that, Gene.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And I think it's yet another example of the type of world that we want to be living in, and we want others, to be taking part in and sharing, is a world where if you have an idea, go for it. try to make it happen.
Yeah.
Use your voice, use the tools that are available to you, use all the platforms, and let the people decide voluntarily whether or not they're digging your education.
Yeah, exactly. Whether or not you're leading them into any kind of real education, and don't let school get in the way of your education. I thought I was the first one to say that, but then I later learned that Mark Twain said it about a century before I did. Yeah.
Right. Well, Gene, I want to thank you so much for being such a big part of my education over the years, and I want to thank you for your friendship as well. And once again, happy birthday, and to many more. So.
Thank you very much, Lou. And I guess my own plug is we're doing a debate on the lockdown at the SOA Forum. We already have a lot of signups for that. That's going to be middle of December. Take a look at my Twitter account at Gene SOA Forum. It's just at Gene SOA Forum, practically my last name now, to follow my news about that and other insights that I hand out to the world. And of course, I always enjoy your tweets as well, Lou.
Thank you, Gene.